So if I had to be pressed, like the faith of a Gaudiya Vaishnava is that everything can be attained through focusing your mind and sacrificing for God. At the same time, the Gita also sort of looks down on people who worship God simply for the purpose of overcoming their own personal suffering. So if you suddenly find yourself without a job or poor, or someone that you love dies, or there's some natural disaster in your home or something like that, and then you decide to devote yourself to God. Well, the Gita doesn't say you should not do that, but it definitely says that's a lesser type of devotion. The highest type of devotion is you simply focus your mind on God because you want to, not because you hope to get something out of doing that. So this sort of brings us to the second part of the question: how does Hindu tradition look at the notion of suffering? Let me first say some sort of general things about Hinduism and suffering. In general, Hindus think that suffering that we experience now is the result of quote-unquote bad karma that we had done in the past. That might be in this lifetime or an infinite number of lifetimes that we've had in the past. It's a rational system, I would argue. It says that any suffering that you have now is the direct result of things that you did in the past. There's nothing that we experience now that we don't in some way deserve, or that we can't be blamed for. The second sort of point that I think is important to note here is that for all the Indian religions, this is something they would, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, I think they would all agree that suffering is a problem for any embodied being. If you have a body, you're going to suffer. And that's true for human beings, it's true for animals and plants. And it doesn't matter how good your life might be, whether you're super rich and famous or beautiful, intelligent, well-educated, you're still suffering like somebody who doesn't have those things. So from an Indian perspective, the problem of suffering is not something that's limited just to a certain group of people. It's a problem for all people. Now obviously there are some people who are suffering far more than others in life, and that needs to be addressed. But from a sort of unique Gaudiya Vaishnava theological perspective on suffering, the tradition says that if you are somebody that's devoted oneself to God, then you should view suffering as not anything at all. It's not a problem. If you're living your life in a way that is devoted to God, then you should disregard suffering. So the great story here is that of Prahlada, who is said to have had a very evil father, sort of like a Darth Vader type of figure, who had said that his father had taken over the entire universe, and he was subjugating people and causing a lot of suffering and torturing people, and he tortured his own son, Prahlad. And he said he threw him in a pit of snakes, and the snakes were biting him, and Prahlad was a great devotee of God, and when asked about suffering, the texts say that Prahlad had, this is from the Vishnu Purana, this is what it says about Prahlad. Prahlad had his mind firmly placed on Krishna while serving him. He felt no pain on his body, being immersed in the divine rapture of contemplating Krishna. The idea here is that if you are completely focused on God, then you won't feel physical pain. I don't know if I can understand that or believe that to be true, but that's what the tradition is saying one should understand suffering as, at the very, very highest level of one's devotion. I would say there's even a more esoteric level in which the Gaudiya tradition says that suffering can be transformed into the highest ecstasy. That in their aesthetic theory, um, the separation that the lover feels from the beloved is even more intense than the feeling of union between the lover and the beloved. So if one thinks of oneself as a devotee of God, as the lover of God, the tradition says that what one feels in the absence of God, the suffering, what they call viraha, of the suffering of separation, is the highest of bliss, and that suffering only heightens the feeling of union between the devotee and God. So again, on the most sort of esoteric level of the tradition, it would say that suffering is something to be desired in separation, in the absence of God, because that will create this very intense reunion of God, with God. In the same way that on a human level, that when a lover is separated from the beloved for some time, that reunion can be very, very intense, and that the sort of ebb and flow of a relationship is intensified by that union and separation. Okay, so to my knowledge, Hinduism never really talked about a crisis of faith. I mean, having said what I did about faith, I think you can see that the notion of a crisis doesn't fit in. Hinduism was challenged first by Buddhism and Jainism. These were two native religions that sort of grew out of a Hindu context, which challenged fundamental Hindu beliefs about the nature of God, the nature of the soul, the nature of scripture, the nature of the world itself. More recently, it's been challenged by Western theologies and sciences and philosophies. But again, to my knowledge, there's never really been a period where the Hindus were like, oh, we're in a crisis. But having said that, I think that in general, Hindu thinkers frame their writing in terms of a dialectical approach, where a view is presented, that view is challenged, and that view is responded to. So I think they'd be, in general, okay with the idea of sort of challenging faith, and they see that as something that makes a belief stronger if you can provide a critique of it and respond to that critique.